Welcome to Family Basics 101. I'm Dr. Bruce McClure, and as we conclude our 5-part series on infidelity, today we will focus on the topic of the recovery from the Infidelity Act. We've made every effort to do a working definition of what infidelity is. We've also talked about the development of infidelity. We've also addressed the disclosure process and what that is really like. And then we talked about the emotions of the disclosure and the pain of the disclosure. So today, let's talk about the recovery process. How do you and how much time does it really take to really recover from infidelity? Keep in mind, first and foremost, that the recovery process is not automatic. Healing is a process. And that process is addressed over time in so many different ways. So many times when a covenant is breached, some people think that we can just sit down and have a summit and put the two parties in the room, the husband and the husband that committed the act, the wife that was the recipient of the act, the wife that committed the act, or the husband that was the recipient of the Infidelity Act. And then they can just have a meeting of the minds. They can pray and they can say, well, we're going to forgive each other and all is going to be well. That's really not how the recovery process takes place. It's a healing process, but it takes place over time. You've got to deal with the emotions, which really involves the anger, the sadness, the hurt, the hate, the fear, the emotions of but I love the person, but I hate the person. The emotions of, I respect the person, but I have no respect for the person. The emotions of, I am happy when I'm around the person, compared to, I hate to be in the company of the person. All of those emotions are now mixed up, jumbled, and it takes a process to kind of sort through the emotional upheaval before that relationship can begin to move forward. There are the spiritual concepts that must be dealt with. Those things like forgiving and those things like trust. Trust in the Lord. Lean not until thy own understanding. Forgive in order to be the recipient of forgiveness. People intellectually understand that. But when infidelity has taken place in the relationship, it really is a process to move into the real practice of forgiveness. On one hand, the words might be uttered, and on the other hand, they may not be. Godly people can say, I will never forgive you for what you've done to me. And in the moment, they really believe that. But over time, they may move into a spirit of forgiveness. They must also deal with the physiological impact of the Infidelity Act. And all of this is part of recovering. Can you imagine the thought of a man or a woman of having to deal with the thought that my husband or my wife has shared their physical body with someone else, and now you are in space with me in my proximity, and I've got to deal with you being in the same room, you being in the same house with me? That is a very difficult process in the recovery process of infidelity. You've been physically connected with someone else, and now I've got to deal with that as I recover and contemplate moving back in a physical proximity or physical space with the person that I once loved, which moves you into the relationship. You've got to heal and recover relationally, putting oneself into a space called one covenant with the one who broke the covenant. That is not an easy task. It's to be settled back into a oneness in a relationship, and yet it is a part of the recovery process. It is a process to move back into that relational covenant. Next, we must deal with the recovery in terms of thinking like this. Before two pieces can be put back as one, each component part that has been broken must first begin healing. In other words, each person, the person who committed the adulterous or infidelitous act in the relationship, and the person who's been the recipient of it, must heal independent of one another. There must be some emotional, spiritual, physiological, and relational healing, one for the other, but many times in a different space. Not physically necessarily, but in the process. The injured spouse must first be in a space that he or she is ready to even contemplate recovery. The spouse who violated the marriage must be in a space to begin owning responsibility for being unfaithful without placing blame somewhere else. Well, if you had taken better care of yourself, then I would not have committed this act. If you had been more affectionate toward me, then I would not have committed this act. If you had given me more positive this and more... No, the reality is a good healing begins with the individual who committed the infidelity act to own all responsibility for the choice that he or she unilaterally made to go out and violate the covenant. Both individuals must be committed to a long-term process of recovery. Both individuals must be willing to accept failure of the relationship as a potential outcome. I understand we say failure is not an option, but the reality is when there is an infidelitous act to violate the covenant, indeed failure is a potential object. It is an option that you don't want to realize, you don't want to deal with the reality of it, but it is a real potential that regardless of what one person does, regardless of what the other person does, the outcome may not be reconciliation. Both individuals must be willing to let the Holy Spirit guide them through the process rather than always the raw emotions. The raw emotions are going to present themselves. The anger, the hurt, the bitterness, all of that is a part of the process of healing. But at some point, you must trust the Holy Spirit to replace those feelings of anger, to replace those feelings of hurt, to replace those feelings of vindictiveness, and move you into the space that God would allow you to be in the reconciliation process. And be willing to admit that that will happen in God's time instead of your time. In the book of Ephesians chapter 4, verse 15, but speaking the truth in love, that you may grow up into him in all things. You keep on speaking the truth throughout the recovery process, but keep in mind that you may grow up into him. Because you begin the process of speaking the truth in the reconciliation process does not mean that the beginning of speaking the truth is the outcome at the end. Look at verse 25 and 27 of Ephesians 4. Wherefore, putting away lying, speak every man truth with his neighbor, for we are all members one of the other. Be angry and sin not. Even as you are putting away the past, there is the potential that the anger is still going to be in the recovery process. But make sure that you're conscious of how you respond to the anger. Do not sin. Recovery is a process. Is it possible? Yes. Is it painful? Yes. I'll see you back in class again next time. Don't be late and don't skip class.